The clash for China's future, Chiang Kai-shek versus Mao Zedong. In the sweltering heat of August 1945, as Japanese officials signed their surrender in Nanjing's ornate reception hall, two very different men watched China's moment of triumph with calculating eyes. One stood resplendent in his Western military uniform, a Christian-educated generalissimo who had led China through its darkest hours, Chiang Kai-shek. The other, hundreds of miles away in his cave headquarters at Yan'an, wore the simple cotton uniform of a revolutionary Mao Zedong. Neither man intended to share power in the peace that would follow. What started as a political rivalry would explode into the largest civil war of the 20th century, a conflict that would see more than 5 million soldiers clash across a battlefield the size of Europe, with armies racing to capture enough Japanese weapons to arm themselves even as they fought. The prize: nothing less than control of the world's most populous nation and the future of East Asia itself. Seeds of conflict: General Marshall's mission in China. General George Marshall stepped off his C-54 transport plane into the bitter Beijing winter of December 1945, carrying what he believed was a formula for peace. President Truman had sent his most trusted advisor to prevent China from plunging into civil war, but Marshall would soon discover that both sides were already preparing for a fight, even as they smiled across the negotiating table. In his private quarters at night, he wrote to his wife, "The situation out here is like nothing I've ever seen. Both sides speak of peace while moving armies like chess pieces." The seeds of conflict had been planted years before, during the uneasy alliance against Japan. While Chiang's nationalist armies had borne the brunt of fighting the Japanese in conventional battles, Mao's communist forces had mastered the art of guerrilla warfare, building support among peasants village by village. Now, with Japan's surrender, both sides raced to accept Japanese surrenders, and more importantly, to secure their weapons. In Manchuria alone, the Japanese had left behind enough rifles, artillery, and ammunition to equip several armies. Behind the facade of peace talks, a shadow war was already underway. Communist agents infiltrated nationalist cities, building underground networks and gathering intelligence. Nationalist planes dropped supplies to isolated garrisons in communist-held territories. In the countryside, local commanders from both sides struck private deals over territory and prisoners, knowing that the facade of unity could collapse any day. The Communists had emerged from World War II with control of about a quarter of China's territory and a fifth of its population. But more importantly, they had won the loyalty of millions through land reform and promises of radical change. Marshall's mission reached its breaking point in the spring of 1946. After months of shuttling between communist and nationalist headquarters, he finally lost patience during a particularly heated negotiation session. Standing up from his chair, he told both delegations, "Gentlemen, I did not come to China to preside over a failure." But that was precisely what was happening. The nationalists, flush with American aid and confident in their superior numbers, believed they could crush the communists militarily. The communists, having survived decades of persecution and warfare, were convinced that victory would come through patience and guerrilla tactics. By summer, the pretense of peace was over. Nationalist armies launched offensives in central China, while communist forces struck at isolated garrisons and rail lines. Marshall departed China in January 1947, his mission a failure. In his final cable to Washington, he wrote words that would prove prophetic. "A catastrophe for which the American government cannot escape major responsibility now appears inevitable." The true war was about to begin, and its scope would exceed anything Marshall had feared. The Manchurian Powder Keg, a turning point in China's civil war. The Soviet Red Army rolled into Manchuria in August 1945 like a crimson tide, overwhelming Japanese defenses in a matter of days. But their rapid withdrawal just months later would prove even more decisive for China's fate. As Soviet forces pulled out of the region's major cities, they left behind an arsenal that would make generals weep. 2,500 artillery pieces, 600 tanks, 800 aircraft, and enough small arms to equip several armies. The race was on. Nationalist troops, ferried north by the US Navy, rushed to claim the industrial heartland, while communist forces slipped out of their mountain bases, moving through the countryside like shadows. In Shenyang, then called Mukden, a drama worthy of a spy thriller unfolded. While nationalist officials drank toasts with Soviet commanders at formal receptions, communist operatives were slipping into weapons depots at night, aided by sympathetic Red Army officers. Lin Biao, the brilliant communist general who would orchestrate much of the coming campaign, had positioned 100,000 troops in the surrounding countryside even before the Soviets departed. He didn't have enough rifles to arm them all yet. The transformation of Mao's guerrilla army into a modern fighting force happened virtually overnight. Peasant soldiers who had never seen anything more sophisticated than a bolt-action rifle found themselves learning to operate artillery pieces, radio equipment, and even tanks. Former Japanese prisoners of war, won over by communist political officers, provided crucial technical training. In mountain bases far from prying eyes, communist forces drilled with their new weapons, preparing for the battles to come. Meanwhile, Chiang Kai-shek made what would prove to be a catastrophic decision. Rather than consolidating his hold on Manchuria's cities and building a strong defensive position, he dispersed his best troops across the region in an attempt to control everything at once. His American advisors warned against this strategy. Spreading forces too thin in hostile territory was a recipe for disaster. But Chiang, ever the proud generalissimo, believed his superior numbers and American-supplied air power would prevail. He would soon learn that in Manchuria's vast spaces and brutal winters, air power meant little against an enemy that could melt into the landscape at will. By the winter of 1945 to 46, Manchuria had become a lethal chessboard. Cities flew the nationalist flag by day, while the countryside belonged to the communists by night. Villages changed hands repeatedly, with peasants learning to hide their true allegiances beneath careful smiles. The region's vast industrial base, railways, coal mines, steel mills, lay like prizes waiting to be claimed. Neither side could know it yet, but the battles for these frozen plains and smoky cities would determine not just the fate of Manchuria, but of China itself. The year of living dangerously, the turning point of 1946. In the sweltering summer of 1946, Chiang Kai-shek sat in his Nanjing office studying reports from the front, convinced he held all the cards. His armies boasted 4.3 million men, American tanks, and a monopoly on air power. The Communists had just 1.2 million troops, many still carrying their old guerrilla weapons. But numbers could deceive. Chiang's fatal miscalculation came in a single order: take Yan'an. He believed capturing Mao's mountain stronghold would decapitate the communist movement. Instead, it would prove to be the bait in a masterful trap. As nationalist forces pushed north toward Yan'an with overwhelming force, Communist units seemed to melt away before them. American advisors celebrated what looked like easy victories. But Mao and his generals were executing a strategy as old as China itself, drawing the enemy deep into hostile territory, stretching their supply lines thin, then striking at their weakest points. While nationalist columns advanced proudly down major roads, communist local forces cut railway lines, ambushed supply convoys, and isolated garrison towns. The first sign that something had gone terribly wrong came from nationalist commanders in central China. Their pacified regions were erupting in rebellion. Communist main forces, far from being trapped in the north, had slipped through gaps in nationalist lines to strike at rich agricultural regions. Chun Yi, the brilliant communist general, led 100,000 troops in a lightning campaign through Shandong province, capturing enough food and supplies to sustain operations for months. When nationalist reinforcements rushed south to respond, they found their fuel and ammunition depots had already been emptied by communist agents who had infiltrated months before. By winter, the true scale of the disaster was becoming clear. Nationalist troops had captured Yan'an only to find it abandoned, its tunnels empty, its printing presses long gone. Meanwhile, they had lost control of vast swaths of countryside. The communist strategy of trading space for time had worked perfectly. Their forces now controlled more territory than ever before, while nationalist armies were exhausted from chasing shadows. In his diary, one American advisor wrote with growing alarm, "They have all the appearances of a modern army, but fight like a guerrilla force. It's a combination we've never faced before." The most bitter blow came in December. A communist force under Liu Bocheng crossed the Yangtze River, long considered an impregnable barrier, and established bases deep in nationalist territory. They didn't need to defeat Chiang's armies in pitched battles. They were winning by transforming the very nature of the war. Each village they entered became a potential base, each peasant a potential spy or soldier. American observers watching from Nanjing began sending increasingly desperate cables to Washington. The question was no longer if the nationalists could win, but how long they could survive. The tide turns, a turning point in the Chinese Civil War, 1947. Deep in a cave in Yan'an, Mao hunched over intelligence reports by lamplight, a cigarette dangling from his lips. The cave walls were covered with hand-drawn maps tracking troop movements across China's vast landscape. What he saw made him smile. Chiang's armies were finally making the mistake he had waited years to exploit. They had spread themselves too thin, trying to garrison every city and defend every railroad. Now was the time to strike. Gathering his generals, he issued the order that would change the course of the war, transform the North China battlefield into the enemy's grave. The communist strategy that emerged was revolutionary in its simplicity. Rather than trying to hold territory, their forces would strike at will, then vanish into a countryside that sheltered them. Local militia units would harass nationalist garrisons until they were isolated and demoralized, while main forces concentrated overwhelming power against single points. The doctrine became known as the 4-point method. When the enemy advances, we retreat. When the enemy halts, we harass. When the enemy tires, we attack. When the enemy retreats, we pursue. In village after village, communist land reform teams followed behind their armies, redistributing property from landlords to peasants. It was a social revolution masquerading as a military campaign. While nationalist propaganda blared from loudspeakers in occupied cities, communist operatives worked quietly in the countryside, building a new social order. A captured nationalist intelligence report warned, "We control the cities by day, but a shadow government rules the villages by night." The breaking point came in late summer. Nationalist forces had nearly exhausted their American aid, while their Soviet-supplied opponents seemed to grow stronger each month. Communist generals had mastered the art of using captured American weapons against their former owners. Liu Bocheng's armies in central China now fielded more American-made artillery than the nationalists they faced. During one battle in Shandong, a nationalist unit was shocked to hear perfect English coming from communist radio operators, former nationalist communications personnel who had defected with their equipment. By year's end, the strategic picture had transformed. Communist forces had grown to nearly 2 million men, now equipped with heavy weapons and supported by a sophisticated logistics network. More importantly, they controlled territory containing 160 million people. While Chiang's government still ruled China's cities, their authority ended at the city walls. In the vast countryside, a new order was taking shape, and with it, the fate of China itself was turning. The fall of nationalist power, 3 decisive campaigns. Lin Biao stood atop a hill in Manchuria in September 1948, surveying the greatest concentration of communist forces ever assembled. Nearly 1 million soldiers had gathered in secret for what would become known as the Liaoshan Campaign. The target was an elite nationalist army of 500,000 men defending northeast China. Lin's operation would become a masterpiece of deception and mobility. While nationalist commanders prepared to defend their main bases, communist forces struck at smaller cities, capturing enough supplies and ammunition to sustain an offensive that would last months. The Huai-Hai campaign that followed would dwarf anything seen in the Chinese Civil War. On November 6, 1948, communist armies converged on the North China Plain in what would become the largest battle in East Asian history. For 65 brutal days, over 1 million men fought across an area the size of England. Nationalist General Du Yuming found himself commanding a pocket of 330,000 troops, completely surrounded. As temperatures plunged below freezing, communist forces tightened their grip. Du radioed Chiang for permission to break out while they still could. The reply came back, "Hold position, relief forces are coming." They never arrived. When the pocket finally collapsed in January, even hardened communist veterans were shocked by the scale of captured equipment. 1,346 artillery pieces, 27,000 machine guns, and enough rifles to equip several new armies. The final act began with the Pingjin campaign for control of Beijing and Tianjin. Fu Zuoyi, the nationalist commander defending Beijing, faced an impossible choice. His 500,000 troops could either fight to the death defending the ancient capital or negotiate surrender. Late one night in January 1949, a secret messenger arrived at communist headquarters carrying Fu's proposal. He would surrender Beijing intact, sparing the ancient city from destruction if his officers and men were treated honorably. Mao personally approved the terms. Within days, communist forces marched through Beijing's ancient gates without firing a shot, as Fu's army laid down their arms in disciplined rows. These 3 campaigns broke the back of nationalist military power in North China. In just 4 months, Chiang had lost over 1.5 million troops, killed, captured, or defected. More significantly, He had lost his best generals, his heavy weapons, and any hope of defending the Yangtze River line. During a late-night meeting in Nanjing, one of Chiang's closest advisors finally spoke the unthinkable. Perhaps it is time to consider withdrawal to Taiwan. The generalissimo stared out his window at the city lights, knowing that soon they would belong to Mao. The only question remaining was how much of China he could salvage from the wreckage of defeat. The fall of a dynasty, China's transformation in 1949. In the pre-dawn hours of January 21st, 1949, a fleet of aircraft roared to life on Nanjing's airfield. Their cargo wasn't weapons or troops, but something far more precious: China's imperial treasures. As communist armies approached the capital, Chiang had ordered the evacuation of the finest pieces from the Forbidden City's vast collection. Palace guards loaded crate after crate of priceless jade, ancient bronzes, and imperial paintings, over 600,000 items in total, while bank officials supervised the loading of gold reserves. The nationalist leader knew he was about to lose China, but he was determined not to lose its soul. The evacuation of Nanjing unfolded like a scene from a fever dream. Government offices worked around the clock shredding documents, while wealthy families bid astronomical sums for space on the last ships and planes leaving the city. In the Treasury building, clerks worked methodically to pack the government's gold reserves, nearly 2.27 million ounces, as the sound of distant artillery grew closer each day. One American observer wrote, "The city feels like a theater where the lights are being turned off one by one, but the actors must keep performing until the final curtain." Meanwhile, communist armies advanced with mechanical precision. Cities fell like dominoes: Tianjin, Guangzhou, Shanghai. But it was not a simple military occupation. In each captured city, underground communist cells emerged from hiding to seize control of vital institutions, while carefully prepared propaganda teams organized mass rallies celebrating liberation. When communist troops finally entered Nanjing on April 23rd, they found government buildings empty but intact, their classified files still warm from the shredders. Chiang's final exit from mainland China was a tableau of dynastic collapse. On December 7th, he boarded the presidential yacht in Chengdu, bound for Taiwan with the remnants of his government. As the ship pulled away, he recorded in his diary, "In the end, we are not defeated by communist weapons, but by communist promises. They promised the people everything while we tried to preserve the old order." Behind him, the mainland was rapidly transforming. On October 1st, 1949, Mao stood atop Tiananmen Gate in Beijing and proclaimed the birth of a new China. The crowd of hundreds of thousands roared their approval, while in Taiwan, Chiang and his followers clung to their claim as China's legitimate government, a fiction that would shape East Asian politics for decades to come. The Civil War had killed over 2 million soldiers and countless civilians. It had turned the world's oldest continuous civilization inside out and redrawn the map of Asia. But perhaps its most profound impact was on the Chinese people themselves. As one peasant told an American reporter, "Yesterday I bowed to my landlord. Today he bows to me." This is not just a new government, it is a new world. The legacy of two Chinas, a nation divided and reborn. History often turns on single moments that reveal larger truths. In December 1949, a British merchant ship, the Sorrowing Prince, found itself caught in a naval standoff in the Taiwan Strait. A nationalist warship demanded it stop for inspection, while a communist shore battery ordered it to proceed. The captain's dilemma reflected the new reality. China had become two worlds, each claiming to be the only legitimate voice of a civilization that had stood unified for millennia. On Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek created what he called Free China, transforming a former Japanese colony into a fortified bastion of the old order. With American support, he built a formidable military machine, always preparing for a reconquest of the mainland that would never come. The treasure ships that had followed him, carrying China's ancient art and much of its gold reserves, provided the seed money for an economic miracle. The refugees who fled with him, including China's technical and business elite, would help transform Taiwan from an agricultural backwater into an industrial powerhouse. Meanwhile, Mao's victory reshaped the geopolitical chessboard. The Soviet Union had gained a powerful ally, while America's worst fears about Asian communism seemed confirmed. But the new China would prove far more independent than either superpower expected. When a journalist asked Zhou Enlai, Mao's shrewd premier, about the revolution's impact on East-West relations, he replied with characteristic subtlety, "Too early to say." More than 70 years later, his words still ring true. The Chinese Civil War never really ended. It just transformed into something far more complex, a contest between competing visions of what China could become. Today, visitors to Taipei's National Palace Museum can still see the treasures Chiang evacuated, while in Beijing's Great Hall of the People, Mao's portrait watches over a nation he would hardly recognize. The war's greatest legacy may be the questions it left unanswered. Can a civilization have two legitimate heirs? What is the true price of revolution? And perhaps most importantly, in the struggle between order and change, does anyone ever truly win? For in the end, neither Chiang nor Mao's vision of China came to pass exactly as they imagined. Each would be transformed by forces their civil war unleashed, but neither could control time, economics, and the unstoppable tide of human aspiration. The story of modern China is still being written, shaped by echoes of decisions made in those fateful years when a nation tore itself apart to be reborn.